Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly. Drop a comment below and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in, and let's begin. The rope bit into Baptiste Dubois' wrists with the kind of practiced precision that spoke of countless previous victims, while the woman who had orchestrated his capture stood silhouetted against the dying Arizona sun like a figure carved from legend and nightmare. Her black hair whipping in the desert wind as she surveyed her prize, with eyes that held secrets darker than the approaching night. She was everything the wanted posters claimed: tall, dangerous, and beautiful in the way that rattlesnakes were beautiful, with curves that could distract a man long enough for her bullets to find their mark, while the twin colts at her hips had sent more souls to judgment than fever or snakebite in all of Cochise County. The Bandit Queen, as territorial newspapers had christened her, moved with the fluid grace of someone who had learned that survival depended on reading danger in every shadow and opportunity in every moment of enemy weakness, while her gang of hardened outlaws watched their captive with the kind of hungry anticipation that wolves reserved for wounded deer who had strayed too far from the safety of the herd. Her reputation for taking wealthy travelers alive was matched only by her creativity in extracting ransom payments from families whose loved ones had been foolish enough to travel the Apache Pass Road without adequate protection or sufficient humility about their place in the brutal hierarchy that governed frontier justice. Baptiste's capture had been accomplished through methods that demonstrated why she had never been taken alive, despite territorial bounties that exceeded the annual budgets of most frontier towns. As her gang's coordination and tactical sophistication had turned what should have been a simple ambush into military-style operation that left him weaponless and helpless, while his companions lay dead in the dust with expressions of surprise still frozen on their faces. The speed and efficiency of the attack had been breathtaking in its violence, while the woman's obvious intelligence and strategic thinking marked her as far more dangerous than common bandits whose survival depended on luck and brutality rather than planning and precision. The note that she discovered tied to his waistband was examined with the kind of careful attention that important documents received from people whose survival depended on understanding every nuance of written communication, while her initial smirk of triumph was gradually replaced by confusion and then shock as she read words that clearly contradicted everything she thought she knew about her captive's identity and purpose in traveling through territory that belonged to her gang by right of conquest and superior firepower. The paper trembled in her hands as comprehension dawned, while color drained from her face like water from a broken pitcher, leaving her staring at Baptiste with eyes that held recognition and horror in equal measure. When she whispered his name with voice that cracked like breaking glass, the sound carried across the desert silence with weight that made her hardened gang members step back in instinctive recognition that they were witnessing something beyond their understanding. While Baptiste's own shock at hearing his identity spoken by lips that had haunted his dreams for 15 years created emotional collision that threatened to shatter the careful walls he had built around memories too painful to examine in daylight. The note that had revealed his true identity now hung between them like a bridge across an abyss that time and tragedy had carved between two souls whose destinies had been torn apart by circumstances that neither had possessed the power to control or prevent. 15 years earlier, the letter that had changed everything arrived at the convent of Sainte Marguerite Marie on a morning when spring rain was washing the dust from adobe walls and filling the air with scents of desert wildflowers that bloomed only after rare moments when heaven opened to bless the harsh Arizona territory with moisture that meant the difference between life and death for everything that struggled to survive in the merciless landscape. Sister Angelique Moreau had been tending the mission garden when the postal rider delivered correspondence that bore the official seal of the territorial capital. while her hands trembled as she recognized handwriting that belonged to the brother she hadn't seen since taking vows that had seemed like salvation from a world that held more sorrow than her young heart could bear. The contents of Baptiste's letter were written with desperation that bled through every carefully chosen word, as his explanation of circumstances that were forcing him to leave Arizona territory revealed dangers that threatened not only his own survival, but also the safety of anyone connected to his name or location, while his plea for her to maintain the fiction of his death was accompanied by financial arrangements that would ensure the mission's prosperity for years to come in exchange for her cooperation in erasing every trace of his existence from church records and community memory. His description of enemies whose reach extended throughout territorial law enforcement and federal agencies made clear that conventional protection was impossible, while his decision to disappear completely was presented as the only alternative to bringing destruction upon innocent people whose lives would be forfeit if his presence were discovered. The tears that stained the pages as she read were matched by the breaking of her heart as she realized that her beloved brother, the only family she had left after Apache raids had claimed their parents and younger siblings, was asking her to treat him as dead while he remained somewhere in the vast American wilderness, alive but forever beyond her reach, or ability to provide comfort during trials that his letter suggested would be worse than anything death could offer. The vows of obedience that bound her to religious life were challenged by familial love that made his request feel like betrayal of everything sacred about human relationships, while her commitment to truth was tested by circumstances that demanded deception for preserving life that honesty would destroy. The decision that she reached after days of prayer and anguish was to honor his request while maintaining hope that divine providence would someday reunite them under circumstances that wouldn't require lies or separation from everything that made life worth living. While her correspondence with territorial authorities confirmed the death of Baptiste Dubois in mining accident, whose details were provided through carefully coordinated story that involved cooperation from men whose loyalty had been purchased through gold that her brother had accumulated during years of honest work before circumstances had forced him into exile. The false grave that was created in the mission cemetery became focus for prayers that were offered daily for someone whose survival depended on the world believing in his death. The years that followed were filled with wondering about his fate and searching every stranger's face for features that might belong to the brother whose absence created emptiness that religious devotion couldn't fill. While occasional reports of mysterious benefactor who provided anonymous assistance to struggling frontier families sparked hope that Baptiste was alive and finding ways to serve others despite dangers that prevented him from acknowledging his identity or returning to relationships that had given his life meaning before tragedy had transformed him into ghost who walked among the living without being able to claim his place among them. The silver mine at Devil's Canyon had been Baptiste's attempt to build legitimate fortune that could provide security for marriage and family life that his love for Elena Vasquez had made essential for any future worth contemplating, while the partnership he had formed with 3 other young men represented friendship and mutual trust that frontier conditions either strengthened into bonds deeper than brotherhood or destroyed through pressures that revealed character flaws hidden beneath civilized pretenses. The strike that they had made in the 3rd month of operation had yielded ore samples rich enough to attract attention from mining companies whose representatives began arriving with offers that would have made all 4 partners wealthy beyond anything their frontier upbringing had prepared them to imagine or manage responsibly. The complications that arose when Consolidated Mining Corporation decided that purchase was less profitable than theft were delivered through legal documents that claimed prior ownership of mineral rights, while also challenging the validity of territorial filing procedures that had granted legitimate claims to men whose only mistake was believing that honest work and legal compliance would be sufficient protection against corporate interests, whose resources included corrupt judges and hired killers whose services could eliminate obstacles that paperwork couldn't remove. The lawsuit that was filed in territorial court was supported by evidence that had been fabricated through methods that exceeded simple forgery into territory, involving systematic corruption of legal institutions that were supposed to protect individual rights against concentrated wealth. The violence that erupted when legal intimidation proved insufficient began with attempts to drive the partners away through sabotage and threats that escalated into direct attacks when their determination to defend legitimate claims became clear to enemies whose patience was exhausted by resistance that threatened profitable operations throughout the region. The night riders who descended on Devil's Canyon were professionals whose methods included torture designed to extract information about ore locations and account numbers where profits had been deposited. While their systematic approach to elimination of witnesses demonstrated planning that exceeded normal criminal activity into territory involving military-style operations that territorial law enforcement couldn't counter without federal assistance, that political corruption made unavailable. The massacre that claimed his three partners was prevented from including Baptiste only through accident of timing that placed him in town purchasing supplies when killers arrived to complete operations that had been planned with precision, that left nothing to chance, except divine intervention, that sometimes protected innocent people from evil that seemed too powerful for human resistance to overcome. The discovery of his friends' mutilated bodies was accompanied by evidence that pointed toward him as perpetrator, while planted evidence and false testimony created legal framework for prosecution that would have resulted in execution for crimes that corporate interests had committed, while ensuring that justice would never reach actual perpetrators whose wealth provided immunity from consequences that law was supposed to impose on criminals, regardless of social position. The escape that saved his life was accomplished through assistance from Elena's family, whose knowledge of border country and connections with Mexican authorities provided refuge until federal investigation could expose corporate conspiracy that had been threatening frontier development throughout territorial Arizona. But the months that followed revealed that corruption extended into federal agencies where corporate influence had purchased protection that made justice impossible through conventional legal procedures, while also ensuring that his survival would result in systematic elimination of everyone who had provided assistance during his flight from false charges that would have ended in judicial murder disguised as legitimate prosecution. The news of Baptiste's supposed death reached Elena Vasquez through official channels, whose careful coordination suggested that his disappearance had been planned rather than accidental. While the grief that consumed her during weeks following the mining camp massacre was complicated by growing suspicion that circumstances were more complex than territorial authorities were admitting to families, whose questions about evidence and investigation procedures were dismissed through explanations that satisfied legal requirements, without addressing obvious inconsistencies in official accounts. Her transformation from sheltered daughter of prosperous rancher to hardened skeptic began with recognition that justice was a luxury that wealth could purchase, while poverty made people vulnerable to systemic corruption that treated truth as commodity to be bought and sold rather than moral foundation for civilized society. The investigation that she conducted independently of territorial law enforcement revealed scope of corporate conspiracy that exceeded anything local corruption had previously achieved, while evidence that she gathered through careful questioning of witnesses and examination of physical evidence demonstrated that mining company interests had been systematically eliminating obstacles to profitable operations through methods that included murder, document forgery, and judicial corruption that made legal remedies impossible for people whose resources couldn't match corporate capabilities for purchasing favorable outcomes from courts and law enforcement agencies whose integrity was for sale to highest bidders. The realization that Baptiste was alive but forced into permanent exile to protect people he loved from corporate retaliation created emotional conflict between joy at his survival and despair at permanent separation that his circumstances required for maintaining safety of everyone connected to his name or previous life. While her decision to follow his example of sacrificing personal happiness for protection of innocent people led to choices that would transform her from conventional frontier woman into something entirely different and far more dangerous than anyone who had known her during years of sheltered existence could possibly imagine. The skills that she acquired during months of preparation for new life included marksmanship that exceeded anything territorial men had achieved through frontier necessity. While her study of military tactics and criminal organization provided knowledge that would enable survival in a world where conventional rules didn't apply and success depended on superior planning and willingness to use violence more effectively than enemies whose experience with frontier lawlessness hadn't prepared them for opponents whose intelligence exceeded their capacity for brutality. The money that financed her transformation came from family resources that were liquidated through careful sales designed to avoid attention, while providing capital for purchasing equipment and recruiting personnel whose loyalty could be purchased through generous compensation and shared commitment to justice that legal institutions couldn't provide. The birth of the Bandit Queen was accomplished through systematic destruction of Elena Vasquez's legal identity and social connections, while the reputation that was carefully constructed through selected criminal activities created legend that served specific purposes of attracting followers whose skills were essential for operations that would ultimately serve justice despite methods that exceeded legal boundaries and social acceptance that conventional morality demanded from people whose circumstances permitted luxury of following rules that others had written for their own benefit rather than community welfare or individual justice that situations sometimes required. The recruitment of her first gang members was accomplished through careful selection of men whose personal grievances against territorial corruption provided motivation that exceeded simple criminal greed, while their individual skills in combat, tracking, and survival created capabilities that could challenge law enforcement and corporate security forces whose effectiveness depended on facing opponents whose resources and organization were inferior to their own systematic advantages in equipment and legal authority. Maria Santos, the former schoolteacher whose family had been murdered by mining company enforcers, brought intelligence and educational background that enabled strategic planning beyond anything conventional criminal organizations achieved through improvisation and brute force, rather than careful analysis of enemy capabilities and systematic exploitation of their weaknesses. The base of operations that was established in Canyon country that territorial authorities considered inaccessible was chosen for defensive advantages that could be held by small numbers against overwhelming attacks, while water sources and supply caches that were created through months of careful preparation provided sustainability for extended operations that could outlast law enforcement efforts to eliminate threats through siege warfare or systematic pursuit that required resources beyond anything territorial budgets could support for extended periods. The communications network that connected various hideouts throughout 3 territories enabled coordination of activities, while also providing intelligence about law enforcement movements and corporate security operations that threatened gang operations or provided opportunities for profitable intervention. The code of conduct that Elena established for gang operations included strict prohibitions against violence toward innocent civilians while also requiring that criminal activities serve broader purposes of justice rather than simple personal enrichment that characterized normal outlaw behavior. While her insistence on protecting women and children created reputation that attracted support from frontier communities, whose cooperation was essential for successful resistance against corporate interests, whose power exceeded anything individual action could challenge through conventional means. The robbing of mining company payrolls and corporate shipments was conducted with precision that minimized bloodshed, while maximizing economic impact on enemies whose profits were being systematically redistributed to families whose lives had been destroyed by corporate violence and legal corruption. The legend that grew around the Bandit Queen was carefully cultivated through actions that demonstrated intelligence and moral purpose that distinguished her operations from simple criminal enterprise, while stories of her protecting travelers from Apache raids and providing assistance to struggling frontier families created public sympathy that made territorial law enforcement reluctant to pursue capture with enthusiasm that corporate interests demanded from officials whose salaries were supplemented through arrangements that purchased cooperation rather than commanded loyalty through respect for legal institutions and community welfare that democratic government was supposed to provide. The success that was achieved through systematic criminal operations created resources that enabled expansion of activities while also attracting attention from federal authorities whose interest in territorial crime was motivated by concerns about corporate corruption and systematic violence that threatened territorial development and federal authority throughout regions where constitutional government required citizen cooperation and effective law enforcement for maintaining legitimate control over populations whose allegiance was earned through protection and service rather than demanded through intimidation and systematic oppression that characterized corporate approaches to territorial governance and resource extraction. The arrival of Federal Marshal Thomas Beaumont in territorial Arizona was motivated by congressional concerns about systematic corruption that was threatening territorial development while also challenging federal authority through corporate influence that exceeded normal business operations into territory involving criminal conspiracy and systematic violence against civilian populations whose protection was essential responsibility of constitutional government regardless of economic interests that preferred exploitation to legitimate development that served community welfare rather than concentrated wealth. His investigation revealed scope of criminal activity that exceeded anything previous federal oversight had uncovered, involving coordination between territorial officials and mining corporations whose methods included systematic murder and judicial corruption that made local law enforcement complicit in crimes against citizens whose rights were supposedly protected by constitutional guarantees. The evidence that Beaumont gathered through careful investigation included financial records that documented payments to territorial judges and law enforcement officials whose decisions had consistently favored corporate interests while ignoring evidence of criminal activity that any honest evaluation would have resulted in prosecutions and convictions for crimes that exceeded normal frontier lawlessness into territory involving organized conspiracy against constitutional government and citizen rights. The testimonies that were collected from surviving witnesses revealed patterns of intimidation and violence that demonstrated systematic elimination of obstacles to profitable operations through methods that violated federal law while also threatening territorial stability and economic development that required rule of law rather than corporate dictatorship for successful achievement. The complexity that federal investigation encountered was intensified by recognition that Elena's criminal activities were serving justice, that legal institutions couldn't provide due to corruption that made conventional law enforcement ineffective against corporate interests, whose resources exceeded anything territorial authorities could mobilize for protecting citizen rights and community welfare. While her methods violated federal law despite moral justification, that circumstances provided for resistance against systematic oppression that constitutional government was supposed to prevent through effective law enforcement and judicial integrity, that purchase had corrupted beyond repair through normal political processes. The dilemma that confronted federal authorities involved choice between prosecuting criminal activities that served justice and ignoring corporate conspiracy that threatened constitutional government throughout territorial regions where federal authority depended on citizen cooperation, that systematic oppression was destroying through violence and corruption that exceeded anything democratic institutions could tolerate without fundamental damage to principles of legitimate government and individual rights, that American political development required for successful expansion and territorial incorporation into constitutional framework that protected rather than exploited frontier populations. The proposal that was developed through federal consultation involved cooperation with Elena's organization for gathering evidence against corporate conspiracy while providing immunity for criminal activities that had been motivated by circumstances that legal institutions had failed to address through conventional procedures. But implementation required establishing contact with bandit organization whose survival depended on avoiding law enforcement while maintaining operations that served both criminal objectives and broader purposes of justice that federal investigation was attempting to achieve through legal rather than violent means that Elena's experience had proven inadequate for challenging corporate power and systematic corruption. The recognition that passed between Elena and Baptiste during those first moments after she read the federal marshal's letter was like lightning illuminating landscape that had been hidden by 15 years of carefully maintained darkness, while the tears that began flowing down her cheeks created tracks through desert dust that had accumulated during years of living as someone else entirely. Transformed by circumstances that had demanded sacrifices neither had imagined possible when their love had been young and the future had seemed filled with possibilities that tragedy and corporate greed had systematically destroyed. The gang members who witnessed their leader's emotional breakdown struggled to understand why discovering a captive's identity had created crisis that threatened everything they had built together through shared commitment to justice and mutual survival in hostile territory. The explanation that Elena provided through broken whispers revealed 15 years of believing that the man she had loved more than life itself was dead. While her transformation into the Bandit Queen had been motivated by desire to serve justice that his supposed death had demanded from someone whose heart had been shattered by loss, but whose spirit had been strengthened by recognition that conventional morality was inadequate for challenging systematic evil that legal institutions couldn't address through normal procedures. The revelation that Baptiste had been alive throughout years, when she had been risking everything to honor his memory, created emotional impact that exceeded anything grief or joy alone could have produced through recognition that their separation had been unnecessary tragedy caused by circumstances beyond their control. The letter that had been tied to Baptiste's waistband was from Federal Marshal Beaumont, whose investigation had finally uncovered evidence that could expose corporate conspiracy while also providing protection for witnesses whose testimony was essential for successful prosecution of crimes that had destroyed countless lives throughout territorial Arizona. While his message included specific instructions for establishing contact with Elena's organization, whose cooperation was necessary for gathering evidence that conventional law enforcement couldn't access through normal investigative procedures, that corporate influence had corrupted beyond effectiveness for serving justice or protecting citizen rights against systematic oppression. The decision that faced Elena involved choosing between personal happiness that reunion with Baptiste could provide and continued commitment to justice that her criminal organization was serving through methods that federal cooperation might make unnecessary if legal institutions could be restored to effectiveness through elimination of corporate corruption and systematic violence that had made conventional law enforcement inadequate for protecting frontier communities against organized criminal enterprise disguised as legitimate business operations that territorial authorities had been protecting through purchased cooperation rather than demanding accountability through honest law enforcement. The embrace that finally brought them together after 15 years of separation was witnessed by gang members whose loyalty to their leader was tested by recognition that personal considerations might influence decisions that had previously been motivated entirely by commitment to justice and protection of innocent people whose survival depended on continued operations against corporate interests, whose elimination required sustained effort and systematic resistance that individual happiness couldn't be allowed to compromise through emotional considerations that exceeded tactical necessity and strategic objectives that their criminal enterprise was designed to achieve. Marshal Beaumont's arrival at the Canyon hideout was accomplished through negotiations that had required Elena's gang to suspend normal security procedures while also demonstrating federal commitment to cooperation rather than prosecution for criminal activities that circumstances had justified despite violation of territorial and federal laws whose enforcement had been corrupted by corporate influence that made conventional justice impossible through legal channels that honest investigation was attempting to restore. His proposal for cooperation between federal authorities and Elena's organization was based on recognition that her intelligence network and operational capabilities exceeded anything normal law enforcement could achieve against enemies whose resources included corrupt officials and systematic violence that exceeded territorial authority for effective resistance or prevention. The evidence that Beaumont presented about corporate conspiracy revealed scope of criminal activity that exceeded anything Elena's independent investigation had uncovered, involving coordination between mining companies and territorial officials whose cooperation had been purchased through arrangements that violated federal law, while also threatening constitutional government and citizen rights throughout Western territories where federal authority depended on legitimate local governance rather than corporate dictatorship, that systematic corruption was creating through purchased influence and systematic intimidation of honest officials whose resistance could be eliminated through violence that exceeded normal criminal activity. The immunity agreement that was offered to Elena and her gang members included complete federal protection and legal absolution for criminal activities whose motivation had been justice rather than personal gain, while their cooperation with federal investigation would provide evidence necessary for prosecuting corporate executives and territorial officials whose crimes exceeded anything previous federal investigation had uncovered through conventional law enforcement procedures that corporate influence had rendered ineffective for serving justice or protecting citizen rights against systematic oppression that required extraordinary measures for successful elimination and prevention of future development throughout territorial regions. The tactical plan that was developed through federal consultation involved using Elena's organization for gathering evidence and conducting operations that federal authorities couldn't accomplish through conventional means, while her knowledge of corporate security procedures and territorial law enforcement corruption provided advantages that could expose criminal conspiracy through methods that exceeded normal investigative capabilities, but which federal oversight could coordinate into systematic campaign for eliminating organized crime and restoring legitimate government throughout territories where constitutional authority required citizen cooperation and effective law enforcement for maintaining democratic institutions. The personal dimension that complicated federal cooperation involved recognition that Elena and Baptiste's reunion was creating emotional factors that could influence tactical decisions and operational effectiveness. While their obvious love and mutual commitment could either strengthen resolve for justice or create vulnerabilities that enemies might exploit through targeting personal relationships rather than organizational capabilities that had made Elena's criminal enterprise successful against opponents whose resources exceeded anything individual resistance could challenge through conventional methods that legal institutions had proven inadequate for providing without federal intervention and systematic reform of territorial governance. The coordination between federal authorities and Elena's gang required careful planning that could prevent detection by corporate security forces whose surveillance capabilities exceeded anything territorial law enforcement typically possessed. while the intelligence that was shared between organizations created operational opportunities that neither could have achieved independently, despite their individual capabilities for gathering information and conducting operations against enemies whose resources included corrupt officials and systematic violence that territorial authority couldn't counter through conventional law enforcement procedures that corporate influence had corrupted beyond effectiveness for serving justice or community protection. The first joint operation that was conducted against Consolidated Mining Corporation's headquarters required Elena's knowledge of security procedures and Baptiste's expertise in explosives that federal authorities couldn't legally employ without jurisdictional complications that political considerations made inadvisable despite tactical necessity for gathering evidence that conventional search warrants couldn't access due to judicial corruption that had been purchased through arrangements exceeding normal business influence into territory involving systematic criminal conspiracy against constitutional government and federal authority throughout territorial regions where legitimate governance required citizen cooperation. The documents that were recovered during clandestine operation revealed financial arrangements between corporate executives and territorial officials whose cooperation had been purchased through methods that violated federal law while also exposing systematic violence against civilian populations whose resistance to corporate expansion had been eliminated through murder and intimidation that exceeded normal business competition into territory involving organized crime and systematic oppression that constitutional government was supposed to prevent through effective law enforcement and judicial integrity that democratic institutions required for legitimate authority over territorial populations. The reaction that corporate discovery of federal investigation provoked included immediate attempts to eliminate evidence through destruction of records and assassination of witnesses whose testimony could result in federal prosecution and conviction for crimes that carried death penalties for treason and conspiracy against constitutional government. While their response demonstrated desperation that made them increasingly dangerous to everyone involved in federal operation whose success depended on maintaining secrecy until evidence could be secured and prosecutions could be initiated through proper legal channels that corporate influence couldn't corrupt or prevent through intimidation and systematic violence. The assassination attempt against Marshal Beaumont was prevented only through Elena's intelligence network, whose sources within territorial law enforcement had detected planning for elimination of federal officer whose investigation was threatening to expose corporate conspiracy that reached into congressional offices and federal agencies where influence had been purchased through arrangements that violated national security as well as territorial law, while the coordinated response that Elena's gang provided demonstrated tactical capabilities that federal authorities had underestimated, despite recognition that unconventional warfare might be necessary for protecting constitutional government against domestic enemies whose power exceeded normal criminal organization. The emergency board meeting that was convened by Consolidated Mining Corporation in response to federal investigation included representatives from affiliated companies whose operations throughout Western territories had been coordinated through arrangements that exceeded normal business cooperation into territory involving systematic criminal conspiracy designed to eliminate competition and resistance through methods that violated multiple federal laws while also threatening territorial development and constitutional government through corruption of legal institutions and systematic violence against civilian populations whose rights were supposedly protected by democratic governance and effective law enforcement. The decision that was reached during corporate consultation involved immediate implementation of contingency plans that had been developed for eliminating federal investigation through systematic assassination of witnesses and destruction of evidence. while their resources for conducting counterintelligence operations included private security forces whose capabilities exceeded anything territorial law enforcement possessed and whose willingness to commit federal crimes was balanced by corporate protection that political influence had purchased through arrangements involving congressional representatives and federal officials whose cooperation could prevent prosecution despite evidence of systematic criminal activity. The mercenary army that was assembled for eliminating federal investigation included professional killers whose experience with military operations and systematic violence exceeded anything conventional criminal organization could provide, while their equipment and tactical capabilities demonstrated resources that challenged federal authority through methods that exceeded normal corporate security into territory involving private warfare against constitutional government and citizen rights that required immediate federal military intervention for protecting democratic institutions and territorial populations, whose safety depended on effective law enforcement that corporate corruption was systematically undermining. The ultimatum that was delivered to federal authorities through intermediaries whose communication couldn't be traced to corporate sources demanded immediate cessation of investigation activities and withdrawal of federal personnel from territorial Arizona, while threats that accompanied demand included specific details about planned violence against government officials and civilian populations whose cooperation with federal investigation had made them targets for elimination through methods that exceeded normal intimidation into territory involving terrorism and systematic assault on constitutional government that required extraordinary federal response for protecting democratic institutions. The intelligence that Elena's network provided about corporate military preparations revealed scope of planned violence that exceeded anything territorial conflict had previously involved. While their systematic approach to eliminating federal investigation included coordination with corrupt territorial officials and foreign mercenaries whose involvement threatened national security as well as local law enforcement, through methods that required immediate federal military intervention for protecting constitutional government against domestic enemies whose power exceeded anything normal law enforcement could counter through conventional procedures that democratic governance typically employed for maintaining legitimate authority over territorial populations. The authorization that President Grant provided for military intervention in territorial Arizona was based on congressional recognition that corporate conspiracy threatened constitutional government throughout Western territories where federal authority required protection against domestic enemies whose power exceeded territorial law enforcement capabilities, while the troops that were deployed included veteran units whose experience with hostile populations and unconventional warfare had been gained through Civil War service and frontier campaigns that prepared them for dealing with corporate mercenaries whose resources and tactical capabilities challenged federal military through systematic resistance that exceeded normal criminal activity into territory involving armed rebellion against legitimate government. The coordination between federal military forces and Elena's organization created unprecedented cooperation between regular army and criminal enterprise whose shared commitment to justice transcended legal boundaries that peaceful circumstances typically required for maintaining social order, while tactical planning that combined military expertise with Elena's knowledge of territorial geography and corporate security procedures created operational capabilities that could eliminate mercenary forces whose presence threatened civilian populations and federal authority throughout regions where constitutional government required citizen cooperation and effective law enforcement for maintaining democratic institutions. The battle that erupted when corporate mercenaries attempted to prevent federal arrests of territorial officials was conducted with intensity that exceeded anything previous territorial conflict had involved, While military engagement that followed included artillery bombardment and cavalry charges that demonstrated federal commitment to protecting constitutional government against domestic enemies whose resources exceeded normal criminal organization, but which couldn't match United States Army capabilities when properly deployed and coordinated through systematic military operations that professional soldiers could conduct against irregular forces regardless of their individual competence or equipment advantages. The siege of corporate headquarters required military engineering and specialized equipment that civilian law enforcement didn't possess, while resistance that was encountered demonstrated mercenary desperation and tactical sophistication that challenged federal forces through methods that exceeded normal frontier warfare into territory involving professional military operations that required systematic approach and superior resources for successful elimination of threats that endangered constitutional government and territorial populations whose safety depended on federal protection against organized violence that exceeded local authority for effective resistance or prevention through normal law enforcement procedures. The victory that was achieved through federal military intervention eliminated immediate threats while also establishing precedents for federal authority over territorial governance when corporate interests challenged constitutional government through systematic violence and corruption that exceeded local law enforcement capabilities, while Elena's contribution to military success created opportunities for federal recognition and legal immunity that could transform criminal organization into legitimate force for protecting territorial development and citizen rights against future corporate conspiracy or systematic oppression that democratic institutions required federal protection to prevent. The reunion that was finally possible between Elena and Baptiste, after federal protection eliminated threats that had forced their separation, represented triumph of love over circumstances that had seemed impossible to overcome through individual action. While their marriage was conducted under federal protection that ensured security against remaining corporate elements whose elimination hadn't been completed despite military victory that had destroyed major mercenary forces and eliminated primary threats to constitutional government and territorial populations, whose safety had been restored through systematic federal intervention and legal reform that Elena's cooperation had helped achieve. The ceremony that united them was attended by gang members whose loyalty to Elena had evolved into respect for federal authority that cooperation had demonstrated could serve justice more effectively than criminal enterprise, despite moral justification that circumstances had provided for resistance against systematic oppression, while federal officials whose appreciation for unconventional assistance exceeded normal law enforcement cooperation provided recognition that Elena's transformation from criminal to federal cooperator represented possibilities for redemption and second chances that democratic society could offer when genuine character change had been demonstrated through service to community welfare and constitutional government. The community that welcomed their marriage included frontier families whose lives had been saved by Elena's protection during years when territorial law enforcement had been corrupted beyond effectiveness. While their recognition that criminal activities had served justice despite violation of legal boundaries created foundation for social acceptance that federal immunity had made possible through official recognition, that circumstances sometimes required extraordinary measures for protecting innocent people against systematic violence and oppression that conventional authority couldn't address through normal procedures that democratic governance typically employed. The home that was established through federal assistance provided genuine fresh start in territory where Elena's reputation as Bandit Queen could be transformed into legend of justice served through courage and sacrifice that exceeded personal safety for protecting community welfare. While Baptiste's knowledge of mining and engineering created economic opportunities that could serve territorial development through legitimate enterprise rather than corporate exploitation that systematic corruption had been enabling through purchased influence and systematic violence against civilian populations whose rights required federal protection for effective guarantee and democratic governance. The announcement of Elena's pregnancy created joy that exceeded anything either had imagined possible when their love had seemed doomed by circumstances beyond their control, while recognition that their child would grow up in territory where justice was served through law rather than criminal resistance provided hope for future that could be built on foundation of redemption and second chances that federal cooperation had made possible through legal recognition that character could be transformed when genuine commitment to community welfare exceeded personal considerations and individual advantage that conventional morality sometimes required for maintaining social stability and democratic institutions. The ranch that Elena and Baptiste established through federal land grants was located in valley that had been cleared of corporate mining operations whose environmental destruction required restoration through methods that combined Baptiste's engineering knowledge with sustainable practices that could serve territorial development without repeating ecological damage that profit-motivated extraction had created throughout regions where corporate interests had prioritized immediate gain over long-term environmental health and community welfare that responsible development required for successful territorial incorporation into American constitutional framework that protected rather than exploited natural resources and frontier populations. The business that was developed through their combined expertise included consulting services for federal authorities whose territorial development projects required knowledge of geography and population dynamics that Elena's years of criminal operations had provided through necessity for survival in hostile environment, while Baptiste's technical skills created opportunities for infrastructure development that could serve community welfare rather than corporate profit through projects that demonstrated how individual success could contribute to territorial prosperity without requiring exploitation of natural resources or systematic oppression of civilian populations, whose cooperation was essential for democratic governance. The relationships that were built with neighboring families demonstrated that Elena's reputation could be transformed through consistent behavior that served community welfare, while their acceptance into territorial society was facilitated by federal recognition and ongoing cooperation with law enforcement activities that protected frontier populations against remaining criminal elements whose operations threatened civilian safety and territorial development through methods that exceeded normal frontier lawlessness into territory requiring federal intervention for effective suppression and prevention of future criminal organization that could challenge constitutional government and democratic institutions. The school that was established through community cooperation provided educational opportunities for frontier children whose futures depended on knowledge and skills that formal instruction could provide, while Elena's contribution as teacher demonstrated intellectual capabilities that criminal reputation had concealed, but which community service revealed through commitment to next generation whose development required investment in human resources rather than simple extraction of natural wealth that corporate interests had prioritized over territorial welfare and long-term prosperity that sustainable development could provide through responsible resource management and environmental stewardship. The medical clinic that Baptiste helped construct through engineering expertise served community health needs that territorial isolation had made difficult to address through conventional medical services, while their cooperation with traveling physicians and federal health programs demonstrated how individual skills could contribute to community welfare through projects that exceeded personal benefit in favor of territorial development that served population needs rather than corporate interests whose profit margins had required systematic neglect of civilian welfare and environmental protection that responsible governance was supposed to provide through democratic institutions and effective public services. The birth of their daughter created joy that transformed Elena's understanding of what life could offer when love and security were protected by legal institutions that served justice rather than corporate interests, while the infant, whose arrival represented hope for future generations, demonstrated that redemption and second chances could create foundations for family happiness and community prosperity that criminal resistance had been fighting to protect through methods that federal cooperation had made unnecessary by restoring legitimate government and constitutional protection for citizen rights and territorial development that served population welfare rather than concentrated wealth. The naming ceremony that was conducted in their community church was attended by neighbors whose acceptance had been earned through consistent demonstration of character and commitment to community welfare, while the blessing that was pronounced over their child included prayers for territorial future that could be built on foundation of justice and democratic governance that Elena's cooperation with federal authorities had helped establish through elimination of corporate conspiracy and systematic corruption that had been threatening constitutional government and citizen rights throughout Western territories, where federal protection was essential for maintaining legitimate authority and effective law enforcement. The baptism that followed religious ceremony represented spiritual renewal for Elena, whose transformation from criminal to contributing citizen had been accomplished through circumstances that demonstrated divine providence working through human courage and federal justice that could protect innocent people against systematic oppression when legal institutions were restored to effectiveness through elimination of corruption and corporate influence that had been purchasing protection for criminal activities that exceeded normal business operations into territory involving conspiracy against constitutional government and democratic institutions, that territorial development required for successful incorporation into American political framework. The celebration that included both former gang members and federal officials demonstrated that reconciliation was possible when shared commitment to justice transcended legal boundaries and personal differences, while their recognition that Elena's leadership had served community welfare despite criminal methods created foundation for understanding that circumstances sometimes required extraordinary measures for protecting innocent people against systematic violence and oppression that conventional authority couldn't address through normal procedures that democratic governance typically employed for maintaining social order and constitutional protection of citizen rights against concentrated wealth and political corruption. The future that was being planned for their daughter included educational opportunities and social advantages that Elena's criminal career had seemed to make impossible. While recognition that federal cooperation had transformed criminal reputation into legend of justice served through courage and sacrifice, created legacy that could inspire future generations to choose service over selfishness and community welfare over individual advantage when circumstances required moral courage for protecting democratic institutions and constitutional government against domestic enemies whose power exceeded normal law enforcement capabilities for effective resistance and elimination. The intelligence that reached federal authorities through Elena's remaining network contacts revealed reorganization of corporate interests whose losses from federal intervention had been substantial but not complete. While new arrangements that were being negotiated between mining companies and foreign investors suggested international conspiracy that could threaten territorial security and constitutional government, through methods that exceeded domestic corporate influence into territory involving foreign interference in American territorial development and federal authority that required immediate investigation and systematic prevention through enhanced federal oversight and military preparedness for dealing with threats that exceeded normal law enforcement capabilities. The assassination attempt against their family was prevented only through security measures that federal protection had maintained despite official conclusion of corporate conspiracy investigation. While evidence that was gathered from captured attackers revealed ongoing criminal organization, whose resources included foreign funding and professional personnel whose capabilities exceeded anything domestic criminal enterprise had previously demonstrated through systematic violence and sophisticated equipment that challenged federal law enforcement through methods requiring military rather than civilian response for effective protection of territorial populations and democratic institutions. The discovery that corporate interests had been coordinating with Mexican cartels for smuggling operations that funded criminal activities throughout territorial regions created international crisis that required diplomatic intervention and enhanced border security for preventing future development of similar threats to American territorial integrity and constitutional government, while evidence that was uncovered through federal investigation revealed scope of conspiracy that exceeded anything previous intelligence had suggested was possible through coordination between domestic and foreign criminal organizations whose shared interests included destabilization of territorial governance and federal authority throughout Western regions. The federal response that was organized for protecting Elena's family and investigating international conspiracy included military intelligence and diplomatic resources that exceeded normal territorial law enforcement, while coordination between federal agencies created unprecedented cooperation for addressing threats that challenged national security, as well as territorial development through systematic criminal activity that required immediate elimination and permanent prevention through enhanced federal oversight and international cooperation with foreign governments, whose own interests were threatened by criminal organizations operating across national boundaries for purposes that exceeded simple profit and included political objectives that threatened democratic institutions. The relocation that was necessitated by ongoing threats required federal witness protection that exceeded normal security measures. While Elena's knowledge of criminal organization and territorial geography made her valuable resource for federal investigation that could expose international conspiracy, while also requiring protection that challenged federal capabilities for maintaining security against enemies whose resources exceeded anything domestic law enforcement had previously encountered through systematic organization and foreign support that enabled operations against federal authority and constitutional government throughout territorial regions where citizen safety depended on effective federal protection and law enforcement. The evidence that federal investigation uncovered revealed criminal network that extended across international boundaries, involving coordination between American corporate interests and foreign governments whose cooperation was motivated by political objectives that exceeded economic considerations. While their systematic approach to destabilizing territorial governance created threats to national security that required presidential intervention and congressional authorization for military operations that could eliminate foreign interference in American territorial development and constitutional government through methods that exceeded normal diplomatic procedures and law enforcement capabilities for addressing international criminal conspiracy. The diplomatic crisis that developed when evidence revealed Mexican government involvement in criminal operations required international negotiations that exceeded territorial authority, while creating opportunities for broader resolution of border security issues that had been affecting American development throughout southwestern territories. While pressure that was applied through federal channels created cooperation from foreign authorities whose own interests were threatened by criminal organizations whose activities served concentrated wealth rather than legitimate governmental purposes, that international law was supposed to regulate through treaty obligations and diplomatic accountability. The military operation that was authorized for eliminating foreign mercenaries required coordination between federal forces and Mexican authorities, whose cooperation was essential for preventing criminal organizations from escaping justice through international borders that normal law enforcement couldn't cross without diplomatic authorization. While systematic approach that was employed included intelligence sharing and tactical coordination that demonstrated how international cooperation could serve mutual interests in eliminating criminal threats that exceeded individual national capabilities for effective suppression and permanent prevention through normal law enforcement procedures. The trials that were conducted for captured conspirators included international defendants whose prosecution required federal courts with jurisdiction over crimes that exceeded territorial authority. While evidence that was presented revealed scope of conspiracy that had been threatening not only American territorial development, but also Mexican stability through criminal activities that served foreign political interests, rather than legitimate business objectives that international commerce was supposed to provide through legal rather than criminal means that violated sovereignty and democratic governance that constitutional government required for maintaining legitimate authority. The sentences that were imposed included death penalties for treason and international conspiracy, while diplomatic agreements that were negotiated provided framework for preventing future criminal cooperation across international boundaries through enhanced border security and intelligence sharing that could detect and eliminate criminal networks before they achieved capabilities that threatened governmental authority and democratic institutions that constitutional government required for maintaining legitimate control over territorial populations whose safety depended on effective federal protection and international cooperation for addressing threats that exceeded domestic law enforcement capabilities. The confrontation that Elena finally had with her past came when former gang members who had chosen criminal careers over federal cooperation were captured during international operations. While their testimony revealed resentment and accusations that challenged her transformation from criminal leader to federal cooperator through questions about loyalty and moral consistency that her choices represented despite circumstances that had justified cooperation with authorities whose protection was essential for family safety and territorial development, that served community welfare rather than criminal enterprise, that systematic violence had made necessary for protecting innocent people against corporate oppression. The trial that was conducted for her former associates created emotional pressure that tested Elena's commitment to federal cooperation, while also providing opportunities for explaining decisions that had been motivated by recognition that criminal resistance was inadequate for achieving justice, when legal institutions could be restored to effectiveness through elimination of corruption and systematic violence that corporate conspiracy had been using for maintaining control over territorial governance and economic development that excluded community welfare and citizen rights from consideration of business operations and political decisions. The testimony that Elena provided about gang operations and criminal activities included detailed knowledge that federal prosecutors needed for completing cases against remaining conspirators. While her obvious regret about methods that circumstances had required was balanced by recognition that criminal resistance had been serving justice when legal institutions were corrupted beyond effectiveness for protecting innocent people against systematic oppression that constitutional government was supposed to prevent through democratic governance and effective law enforcement, that corporate influence had systematically undermined through purchased cooperation and intimidation. The sentences that were imposed on her former associates reflected judicial recognition that circumstances had created moral complexity that exceeded simple legal categories, while federal protection that was provided for Elena's family demonstrated government commitment to protecting witnesses whose cooperation had served justice despite personal cost and social disruption that transformation from criminal to federal cooperator had required through choices that challenged conventional morality but which served community welfare and constitutional government when legal institutions were restored to effectiveness through systematic reform and federal oversight. The reconciliation that was achieved with surviving gang members who accepted federal immunity created foundation for understanding that redemption was possible when genuine character change had been demonstrated through service to community welfare, while their recognition that Elena's leadership had served justice despite criminal methods provided personal closure that enabled emotional healing and family security that federal protection had made possible through legal recognition that circumstances sometimes required extraordinary measures for protecting innocent people against systematic violence and oppression that exceeded normal law enforcement capabilities. The official recognition that Elena received through territorial governor's visit represented unprecedented acknowledgement of criminal transformation into federal service that had exceeded anything previous cooperation had achieved through assistance that eliminated international conspiracy while establishing legal precedents for redemption and second chances that democratic society could provide when genuine character change had been demonstrated through sacrifice and service to community welfare and constitutional government that territorial development required for successful incorporation into American political framework that protected, rather than exploited, frontier populations and natural resources. The ceremony that was conducted in their home included presentation of territorial citizenship papers that recognized Elena's contribution to law enforcement and community safety, while federal commendation that accompanied territorial recognition demonstrated government appreciation for cooperation that had exceeded normal witness assistance through leadership and tactical capabilities that had been essential for eliminating criminal networks and foreign interference that threatened territorial security and constitutional government throughout Western regions where federal authority required citizen cooperation and effective law enforcement for maintaining democratic institutions and legitimate governmental control. The speech that Governor Martinez delivered acknowledged complexity of Elena's transformation while emphasizing importance of second chances and redemption that democratic society could offer when people demonstrated genuine commitment to community welfare and constitutional government, while his recognition that circumstances sometimes required extraordinary measures for protecting innocent people created foundation for understanding that moral judgment should consider motivation and results rather than simply methods that desperate situations had required for serving justice when legal institutions were corrupted beyond effectiveness through systematic corporate influence and political corruption. The community celebration that followed official ceremony demonstrated territorial acceptance of Elena's transformation from criminal to contributing citizen, while recognition that her cooperation with federal authorities had served community welfare and territorial development created social foundation for family security and economic prosperity that legitimate enterprise could provide through honest work and civic participation that democratic citizenship required for maintaining constitutional government and effective law enforcement that protected rather than oppressed frontier populations whose cooperation was essential for successful territorial governance. The future that was discussed during Governor's visit included expanded role for Elena in territorial development and federal law enforcement activities that could utilize her knowledge and experience for preventing criminal organization and protecting community safety. While opportunities that were outlined for family prosperity and social advancement demonstrated that redemption was genuine and permanent when supported by legal recognition and community acceptance, that federal cooperation had earned through service to justice and constitutional government that exceeded personal considerations and individual advantage for sake of territorial welfare and democratic institutions. The federal appointment that was offered to Elena as territorial law enforcement consultant represented unprecedented recognition of criminal transformation into government service, while her acceptance of position that would utilize knowledge and experience for preventing criminal organization created opportunities for systematic protection of frontier communities against threats that exceeded normal law enforcement capabilities through cooperation between federal authorities and territorial populations whose safety depended on effective intelligence and tactical coordination that her background had prepared her to provide through legal, rather than criminal means. The office that was established in territorial capital provided headquarters for operations that coordinated federal and territorial law enforcement activities throughout regions where criminal organization threatened community safety and constitutional government, While resources that were allocated for Elena's operations exceeded anything previous territorial law enforcement had possessed, through federal funding and equipment that demonstrated government commitment to preventing future development of systematic criminal enterprise that could challenge democratic institutions and territorial development through violence and corruption that effective law enforcement was designed to eliminate. The success that was achieved through systematic law enforcement operations included elimination of remaining criminal networks and prevention of new criminal organization through intelligence activities and tactical intervention that protected frontier communities against threats that exceeded normal territorial authority. While Elena's leadership demonstrated that redemption was permanent and genuine when supported by legal recognition and federal cooperation, that could transform criminal experience into valuable resource for protecting community welfare and constitutional government against domestic enemies whose power required extraordinary measures for effective elimination. The family that had grown to include 2 additional children represented triumph of love and redemption over circumstances that had seemed impossible to overcome. While their prosperity and social acceptance demonstrated that democratic society could provide opportunities for genuine transformation when people possessed commitment to community welfare and constitutional government that exceeded personal considerations and individual advantage for sake of territorial development and federal authority that protected rather than oppressed frontier populations whose cooperation was essential for maintaining legitimate governmental control and effective law enforcement. The legacy that was being created through Elena's federal service included legal precedents for cooperation between criminal organizations and law enforcement authorities when circumstances required extraordinary measures for protecting community welfare. While educational programs that were developed through her experience provided training for future law enforcement personnel whose effectiveness against criminal organization would be enhanced through understanding of criminal methods and psychology, that her transformation had made available for serving justice and constitutional government through legitimate rather than criminal means that democratic institutions required for maintaining authority and protecting citizen rights. 20 years after the letter that had revealed Baptiste's true identity to the woman who had captured him in the desert, Elena Dubois stood in her federal office reading correspondence from President Cleveland, commending territorial law enforcement achievements that had made Arizona a model for criminal prevention and community safety throughout Western territories, where federal oversight had eliminated systematic corruption while establishing democratic institutions that served citizen welfare rather than concentrated wealth that previous corporate influence had prioritized over constitutional government and territorial development that protected rather than exploited frontier populations and natural resources. The ceremony that was being prepared to honor Elena's retirement from federal service would be attended by law enforcement officials and territorial leaders whose careers had been shaped by precedents that her cooperation had established for redemption and second chances in democratic society. While the monument that was being erected in territorial capital would commemorate transformation from criminal resistance to federal service that had eliminated international conspiracy and established legal framework for protecting constitutional government against domestic enemies whose power exceeded normal law enforcement capabilities through systematic organization and foreign support that required extraordinary measures for effective elimination. The university that had been established through federal funding included criminology program that studied Elena's transformation and federal cooperation as example of how criminal experience could be converted into valuable resource for protecting community welfare when genuine character change had been demonstrated through service to justice and constitutional government. While research that was being conducted provided foundation for understanding criminal motivation and prevention methods that could eliminate future development of systematic criminal organization through addressing social and economic conditions that created opportunities for criminal recruitment and resistance to legitimate governmental authority. The grandchildren who played in gardens surrounding their family home represented hope for future generations, who would grow up in territories where law enforcement served justice rather than corporate interests, while education that they were receiving emphasized civic responsibility and democratic values that Elena's sacrifice had helped preserve through cooperation with federal authorities whose protection had made possible family security and social prosperity that criminal resistance alone could never have achieved despite moral justification that systematic oppression had provided for extraordinary measures against corporate conspiracy and political corruption. The letter that had started everything was preserved in territorial archives as historical document that demonstrated how personal love could catalyze social transformation when individuals possessed courage to choose service over selfishness and community welfare over individual advantage. While its legacy included federal law enforcement procedures and territorial governance reforms that had eliminated systematic corruption while establishing democratic institutions that could protect citizen rights and constitutional government against concentrated wealth and political influence that threatened legitimate authority and effective law enforcement throughout regions where frontier development required federal oversight and citizen cooperation for maintaining democratic institutions and territorial prosperity that served entire populations rather than privileged elites whose exploitation had been eliminated through legal, rather than violent means that constitutional government provided for protecting individual freedom and community welfare in territories where justice finally rode free because people had learned that redemption was possible when genuine transformation was demonstrated through sacrifice and service to principles that exceeded personal gain and individual advantage for sake of democratic values and constitutional government that protected rather than oppressed the magnificent diversity that made America strong enough to provide second chances for all its children, regardless of past mistakes in territories where love and courage had conquered fear and hatred through hearts large enough to forgive while remaining strong enough to protect what was right.